Good afternoon and welcome to the 20th century. In this last, at long last, it gives me great pleasure to moderate this very last panel with an old friend and a new friend from Brazil, and also gives me great pleasure that we are going to focus on an artist from Canada and one from Brazil. And with the exception from man from Canada, it's all women all the time, which is what I love. So I'm going to go and I'm going to introduce Sara Angel, who will speak first on Lawren Harris, and then Regina, who will speak about Tarsila Damaral. Sara Angel is the founder and executive director of the Art Canada Institute at the University of Toronto. She holds a Trudeau Doctoral Scholarship, the most prestigious award of its kind in Canada, given for innovative ideas that will help solve issues of critical importance to Canadians. And if you're wondering if it's that Trudeau, I don't know how many of you follow Canadian politics, but the original Trudeau-mania Prime Minister is the father of the current incredibly attractive Prime Minister we have in Canada. And this very prestigious scholarship is named after Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the original. Sara Angel is a recognized authority on visual culture, and she has been a guest lecturer at Harvard University, the University of Toronto, Ryerson University, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the National Gallery of Canada. Please help me welcome Sara Angel.
Thank you, Georgiana. And before I begin, I must offer my deepest thanks to the wonderful people who put this symposium together and who invited me to be here. PJ, I don't know where you are, Valeria, Georgiana, and Mindy, and you and your amazing team at Crystal Bridges. If this is the first symposium that you're holding, the benchmark is pretty high, and I look forward to seeing what the future brings. So thank you again. With his arresting and spiritually charged paintings of icy plains, lakes, and mountains, throughout the 1920s, Lawren Harris became famous for his iconic images of Canada, such as the ones we have now on screen, Mount Lefroy and Lake Superior. He also became the leader of the country's most influential artist movement, the Group of Seven. But this was not the legacy that Lawren Harris dreamed of. Harris wanted to move beyond the country's art scene and to contribute to art movements south of the border. For much of his life, however, this goal eluded Harris. He was stifled by the Group of Seven's self-generated mythology that the inspiration and the influence of their art making was exclusively the Canadian landscape. This afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about the painting, Grounded Icebergs. The work is a window into a little-told story about how Harris's creative goals reflected his interest in being part of a continental art movement and his interest in the artists Georgia O'Keeffe and Rockwell Kent. Grounded Iceberg depicts a site that Lawren Harris and A.Y. Jackson, a fellow Group of Seven member, came upon in the summer of 1930. The men were on a 2-month journey to the Arctic aboard a government supply ship that followed the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland. Harris took the trip because, as he wrote to his dear friend Emily Carr in the weeks before setting out, quote, "I hope to get loosened up and somewhat freed from solidifying inhibitions. I am in great need of losing my bitterness and sharing completely in the life of the universe," end quote. Harris chose the Arctic as a destination because he believed that the top of the continent was the source of a spiritual flow. He found the scene for Grounded Icebergs just off of Godhaven, Greenland, where seemingly out of nowhere a sublime image presented itself epic mountains of frozen water jutting from the ocean stillness into a cool, clear sky. Yet, despite Harris's enchantment with the scene, it took him many months after returning home to Toronto to put brush to canvas. And when he did sit down to execute the work, he did so in a manner that he had been following for almost a decade, a manner that set him apart from other members of the group of seven. A close look at Grounded Iceberg reveals an absence of brush strokes. Its forms are highly simplified and stylized, and the painting is part of a continuum that Harris had been pursuing since the fall of 1921 after he visited Lake Superior's North Shore. From that moment, throughout the next decade, Harris's depictions of the Canadian wilderness changed radically. He went from using a post-impressionist palette to execute bright and painterly urban and rural landscapes like the gasworks, like decorative landscape, like houses on Gerrard Street, like Algoma Hill and street scenes, to depict icy and austere forms like above Lake Superior. In doing so, Harris developed an identity that set his paintings apart from that of other Group of Seven members, including J.E.H. MacDonald and Tom Thompson. Grounded Icebergs can be seen as a painting that marks the apotheosis of Harris's signature style, but it was not a work that pleased him. In May 1931, Harris exhibited Grounded Icebergs at the Art Gallery of Toronto, along with 5 other Arctic paintings, including Icebergs' David Strait, works which Harris unexcitedly described as, quote, mostly indifferent, end quote. Harris's poor opinion toward the works helps explain why just months following the first public showing of Grounded Icebergs, he stopped painting altogether, cold turkey. It would be another 4 years before Harris picked up a brush again. And when he did so, he emerged like a butterfly from a cocoon as a very different kind of artist. So in other words, Grounded Icebergs can be understood as a painting that marks the end of one life as Harris as an artist and the start of another. A bit about Lawren Harris. Heir to the famous farm machine manufacturer Massey Harris Limited, Lawren Harris grew up wealthy, educated, and with a passion to understand international contemporary art. In 1904, after attending the University of Toronto, he set out for Berlin, where he spent the next 4 years learning the methods of Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Manet, techniques which he brought back to Canada and applied to rendering landscapes like this work, Cottages. Cosmopolitan, articulate, and elegant, Harris, who incidentally was very famous for always painting in a 3-piece suit, was the perfect patrician voice to lead the rallying cry for Canadian art through the 1920s, something that he did, emphatically striking up with friendships with painters who shared his vision, a circle that became known as the Group of Seven. Inspired by the American transcendentalist Walt Whitman, whom he counted among his favorite authors, Harris made art that celebrated Canadian outdoors and the divinity of nature. Yet despite his 4 years of study in Europe, Harris insisted that his art had no foreign ancestry, as he warned Canadians, if we imitate the creators of other lands, we bow to traditions, taboos, creeds imported from across the sea. And yet, throughout the 1920s, as Harris created those spine-chilling images of seas, skylines, lakes, and mountains, he had one eye trained on what was happening internationally, How do we know this? Well, because starting in the early 1920s, Harris began to compile a scrapbook that exists today at the Library and Archives of Canada. And in that scrapbook, he pasted reproductions by works of artists whom he admired, including Brancusi, Rodin, Henri Rousseau. But of all the artists whose images he collected, there are only two artists whose works show up in the scrapbook multiple times. And those artists are Rockwell Kent and Georgia O'Keeffe. Their paintings offer a context for the making of Grounded Iceberg and suggest why, when Harris did restart his career in 1934, it was with a very different style. Now, the most pervasive interpretation for Harris's stylistic transformation of the 1920s, that transformation that gave us those geometric, pared-back landscapes, is Harris's self-identification as a theosophist, a mystical approach to the world that promotes a quest for the spiritual and states that in painting, natural space should be simplified to fundamental forms. Virtually every painting that Harris made from 1921 throughout the rest of the decade has been interpreted through the lens of theosophy. For example, when the Art Gallery of Ontario acquired Grounded Icebergs, it described the painting's Arctic mountains like this, quote, that they were a symbol of power as demonstrating the cycle of birth, development, death, and reincarnation, end quote. Now, while theosophy unquestionably played a part in shaping Grounded Icebergs, along with other depictions that Harris made of the sublime, such as figures with rays of light, theosophy was not the only influence on Harris. I believe that the works of other artists, namely Rockwell Kent and Georgia O'Keeffe, were of equal importance to Harris's stylistic development. When Rockwell Kent's paintings were included in an exhibition at Toronto's Art Gallery in 1920, Harris openly exalted them, and only them, of all the other paintings in the show, as the most important works, and Kent as the most important artist. There was much that Harris and Kent shared in common. Born in 1882, just 3 years before Harris, Kent attended the New York School of Art, where his teacher, Robert Henri, promoted the need for an American-based art inspired by domestic scenes and subjects. Like Harris, Kent was committed to finding inspiration in the North American landscape, warning, the most important thing that we can do is work together to change the center of artistic production from Europe to America. Inspired by his teacher, Robert Henri, and moved by the transcendental writings of Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson, Kent painted scenes of the New England landscape. As well, he lobbied American collectors and museums to support their nation's artists, which was a daring thing to do at the turn of the 20th century, when most American schools emphasized the imitation of European styles. Kent was also a graphic designer and a writer who, by 1920, achieved prominent literary status. The New Statesman declared his book Wilderness easily the most remarkable title to come out of America, since Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Like Harris, Kent's art also underwent significant transformation in the early 1920s. As he was completing Wilderness, Kent traveled to South America, where he painted Calm, also known as Tierra del Fuego. With this work, Kent, like Harris, abandoned his use of painterly brushwork and his preference for depicting, and he turned toward a preference for depicting the landscape as abstract, flat patterns rendered with sleek, smooth finishes. Kent's new stylistic direction reflected his interest in precisionism, a term that Alfred Barr coined to describe such works by Kent and other American artists of the period, including Charles Demuth, Charles Sheeler, and George O'Keeffe, who depicted landscapes and industry with clean, simplified lines, much like Harris's rounded icebergs. Within months of Kent's completion of Calm, Harris unveiled his work Above Lake Superior and his new precisionist-like approach to painting. Although contemporary art historians have paid little attention to the connection between these two works, the relationship between them did not go unnoticed in the 1920s. The art critic for the Toronto Mail and Empire described Above Lake Superior as, quote, one of those paintings in which the work of Mr. Harris makes one think of Rockwell Kent on account of the simplicity of his design and his use of color. Kent, however, was not the only artist on Harris's mind when he painted Grounded Icebergs. In 1934, Harris moved to New Hampshire to take a position at Dartmouth College. Away from home, Harris began to paint again, only now, as I had mentioned before, in a new, different manner, a manner that I believe can be tied to the painting of George O'Keeffe. Before leaving for the Arctic, Harris wrote, "Profundity is the interplay of Mother Earth and the spirit of eternity, which, though it sounds incongruous, means nature and abstract qualities fused in one work," end quote. Although Harris never achieved this vision of abstraction while he was still living in Canada, at Dartmouth he began painting anew, and when he did, he created surprising new works like the ones on screen. Winter Comes from the Arctic to the Temperate Zone, and his first fully abstract work, Poise. Using forms from landscape, in 1934, Harris sought to portray the topography of imagination, where, as he described it, all vistas were sublime. Harris's Dartmouth paintings of the early 1930s were a world apart from his Group of Seven origins, but they were also a world apart from the work of Rockwell Kent, who never could accept abstraction. In 1935, Kent painted Artist in Greenland, a work much closer to that of an illustrator than the art of an ecstatic. Like the rest of the Robert Henri Circle, Kent did not support abstraction and what he called the experimental distortions of reality which the Armory Show had brought to the United States. As Kent put it, quote, "I am, in many important respects, unmodern, and in art, I oppose current conceptions," end quote. For Harris, however, the representational world was no longer enough. The spirit of eternity could not be found with the brush of realism, as the work of O'Keeffe so powerfully demonstrated to him. In 1926, the New York art impresario, Catherine Dreyer, showed O'Keeffe and Harris together. This was probably not the very first time they met, but it's certainly a well-documented time that their work was in the same place. And their work was shown together at the International Exhibition of Modern Art at the Brooklyn Museum. The show was mounted by the Société Anonyme, which Dreyer co-founded with Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp to promote avant-garde art in the wake of the First World War. Dreyer approached Harris, the only Canadian participant in the Société Anonyme, after she had seen his painting, Northern Lake, in the Philadelphia Sesquicentennial, where it had won the gold medal. With Harris's entry into the Société Anonyme, he took his first steps forward into joining the formal conversation on contemporary art of a continental nature. While Kent, and his circle felt no connection to the abstracted works in the Brooklyn exhibition, Harris held forth so strongly about the show's significance that he brought it to the Art Gallery of Toronto, now the Art Gallery of Ontario, in 1927. And when he did, he took a lot of heat for it. From Harris's scrapbook, we know that O'Keeffe's art had an influence on his landscape painting beginning in the early 1920s. O'Keeffe's 1921 Blue and Green Music was one of the reproductions Harris snipped out of an art journal, saved, and pasted in his personal notebook. It is a work whose diagonal striations Harris paralleled in the sky of his painting, Icehouse, Coldwell, Lake Superior. Around 1928, after Dreyer showed O'Keeffe and Harris's work together, almost side by side, he executed Lake Superior 3, an image of an anthropomorphic tree trunk, not unlike O'Keeffe's Grey Tree, Lake George, which was part of the Société Anonyme exhibition. Just as with Kent, there was much for Harris to admire in O'Keeffe, whose art he championed enormously strongly. The only O'Keeffe painting, The Eggplant, that is owned by the Art Gallery of Ontario, came to the institution through Harris's advocacy for the work. In particular, Harris was drawn to O'Keeffe's artistic values, which were rooted in Whitman and centered on the emergence of a continental cultural voice. Of her countrymen who decamped to Paris, O'Keeffe asked, if they didn't even want to live in New York, how was the great American thing going to happen? Like Kent, O'Keeffe, who grew up on a dairy farm in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, drew inspiration from the land. Where I come from, she stated, the earth means everything. A critical aspect, however, separated the Midwestern painter O'Keeffe from Kent. Whereas he abhorred abstraction, O'Keeffe embraced it as a vital means to depicting her surroundings. Now, as Harris sat down in 1930 to start the painting Grounded Icebergs, there was a well-publicized exhibition taking place in New York at the American Place Gallery. And it is an exhibition that we don't have definite documentation that Harris saw, but we know that Harris was in New York during this period, that he did have a relationship with Stieglitz, and so the likeliness that he saw this exhibition was very, very high. The exhibition featured works inspired by O'Keeffe's 4-month stay in Taos, New Mexico, an experience that she described as life-changing, during which she resolved to spend a part of each year from then forward in the Southwest. On the trip, O'Keeffe painted scenes like her 1929 work, Blue, Gray, Black, Pink Circle, in which geometric whorls of color depict the motion of Hopi Kachina dancers in the desert, their steps amplifying the rhythmic gestures of the universe. For Harris, I would imagine, such a painting presenting the New Mexican terrain in the realm of abstraction would surely have been an example of what he was striving for when he set out for the Arctic, but when he came back with such disappointing results. What he was after, again, was abstraction fused with spirituality, as he put it, the depiction of a union of Mother Earth and the spirit of eternity. In 1938, Harris relocated from New Hampshire to Santa Fe. And I want to note that this relocation has been documented by art historians as happenstance, that Harris was on a motor holiday, he arrived in New Mexico, loved it so much, and he wanted to stay. I would argue that I think the likeliness of the happenstance, it's a far distance to just end up by chance. But also, we know that when Harris arrived in the city, O'Keeffe, who lived nearby in Taos, was not only its most famous resident and one of North America's most talked about painters, she was already someone who Harris admired deeply and unquestionably. In New Mexico, Harris, along with Emil Bistram and Raymond Johnson, formed the Transcendental Painting Group, dedicated to non-representational works of color, light, and design. In the American Southwest, in the late 1930s, Harris then moved deeply into the second phase of his career, in which he created canvases like Composition Number 1. At this point, and from this point onward, he only depicted abstract works. And for an artist who had defined himself as a painter of Canadian landscapes, this stylistic shift was absolutely monumental. For the next 30 years, the remainder of his life, Harris continued to be an abstract painter, one who was resolved to forge a continental approach to modernism, one who was determined to present a spiritual landscape of the mind. But this body of work, his abstract body of work, gained little traction. Restrictions at the outbreak of the Second World War made it impossible for Harris to stay in the United States and impossible for him to transfer funds from Canada. And so in 1940, he moved back to Canada. He resettled in Vancouver, a city whose art scene really had not yet emerged. There, in the nostalgic post-war climate, people looked to Harris for a nationalist notion of Canada that he had promoted before leaving the country. They took little interest in the abstraction. They longed for those icebergs. And Harris was therefore pulled back into talking about the Group of Seven, and his identity became synonymous with the paintings that he had made a decade earlier, works of lakes, works of snow, works of Arctic, the very works which Steve Martin is now promoting at the Hammer Museum in LA. So something that I think, Harris's greatest success, in other words, became his Achilles heel, because those works were the works that he was proud of, but certainly were not the works that he saw as defining his life as an artist. And so the story of how Harris forged a fresh approach to landscape painting that represented a decidedly North American voice took a back seat to the nation's sentimental longings. Still, Harris's efforts to establish a new vision were not all lost. Although Harris never lived outside of Canada again, he remained a pioneer advocating on behalf of Vancouver's growing cultural scene. And until his death in 1970, he urged the city's artists to see art, as he described it, a new adventure largely before us. Harris's non-representational paintings may not be his most celebrated works, but they gave those around him permission to make more adventurous art. And in doing so, I believe they laid a foundation for a city that would soon be famed for what Harris had dreamed of, art that was North American in origin, but universal in its meaning. Thank you.